Shroud of Turin, an archaeological evidence that proves the Bible. The Shroud of Turin, also called the Holy Shroud, is a piece of linen cloth depicting a faint image. It has been revered for centuries as the authentic burial shroud that was used to wrap the body of Jesus of Nazareth after his crucifixion, and on which an image of Jesus' body was miraculously imprinted. In 1898, Second Paya produced the first photographs of the shroud, which showed that the human image on it can be seen more clearly in a black and white photographic negative than in its natural sepia color. This discovery is still relevant today, as it helps in better understanding the shroud and its features. The shroud has a documented history dating back to 1354, when it was exhibited in a church in north-central France. Amazingly, this negative image possesses 3D details that go beyond the capabilities of paintings. Botanical and DNA connections. In a pivotal moment of revelation in 2002, conservation efforts in Italy unveiled a hidden secret. The removal of the 16th century backing cloth exposed a rare type of stitch on the back of the shroud, a stitch known only from one other place, the Masada Fortress in Israel. This archaeological connection adds layers of authenticity to the shroud story, as Masada was a witness to the Jewish revolt, aligning with the historical timeline of Jesus. The shroud's narrative. The presence of multiple wounds, consistent with Roman scourge. Marks on the cloth match lead balls from a whip, and there's a wound on the chest with both blood and clear fluid, suggesting the heart stopped beating. The shroud's journey is not just about what's on it, but where it's been. The agony and burial of Jesus through the Shroud of Turin. As we dive deep into the story depicted on the Shroud of Turin, we are transported to the harrowing moments leading to Jesus' crucifixion. Before the final act of sacrifice, Jesus endured a brutal and dehumanizing series of torments, each excruciating detail etched into the fabric of the shroud. Stripped and subjected to a merciless flogging, the flagrums used were tipped with both blunt and sharp objects, tearing into his flesh and reducing it to shreds. The agonizing process left the body battered and covered in wounds. To intensify his sufferings, soldiers fashioned a crown of thorns, not delicately woven, but hastily twisted from branches. After this merciless display of brutality, Jesus, now bearing the weight of his own cross, was dressed in his blood-stained garments and forced to carry the 150-pound burden. Despite the pain and loss of blood, he struggled forward, each step a grueling journey. The wooden cross dug into his shoulder, exacerbating the wounds from the flogging and inflicting additional torment as it banged against the thorny crown, sending sharp stabs of pain into his head. It is difficult for most of us to anticipate a major incident, let alone a scourge. Did Jesus know what would happen? Did he want this to happen? Did he warn his disciples? How did he handle the stress? Watch this video until the end to find the answers. For now, let us see what caused that much detail to show up on the Turin. Tripping and falling under the immense weight of the cross, Jesus endured yet another wave of suffering. The impact crushed his chest against the ground, twisting his arm and wrenching it severely out of its socket. The cross, now atop him, pressed into the back of his neck and shoulders, partially paralyzing him. His head sagged to the right, rendering his right side useless. In the state of agony, heartless soldiers callously pulled him up by his dislocated arm, forcing him to continue the journey with the cross now on his left shoulder. Bent over in pain and weakness, his right arm hung helplessly by his side. The staggering steps forward were a testament to his resilience amidst unimaginable suffering. As we reflect on these vivid details imprinted on the Shroud of Turin, the narrative unfolds with stark realism. Each mark, each wound, tells a story of unparalleled sacrifice and suffering. The shroud, like a silent witness to these agonizing moments, invites us to contemplate the depth of Jesus' sacrifice and the profound love that compelled him to endure such brutality for the sake of humanity. In the end, the shroud not only preserves the physical remnants of this crucible of pain, but also serves as a powerful testament to the resilience of faith and the enduring message of hope that emerged from the darkest hours of human history. Another question is who originally owned this cloth? Did Jesus pay for his burial, or was there someone else? Keep watching till the end and we will cover this. The crucifixion and burial on the Shroud of Turin. As we approach the culmination of Jesus' journey, the Shroud of Turin vividly captures the heart-wrenching scene on Golgotha. His clothes, now soaked with blood, were mercilessly ripped from his body, reopening wounds that had started to adhere to the fabric. Helplessly thrown onto the cross, the soldiers proceeded to nail his already distorted and dislocated right arm, causing excruciating pain as nerves and ligaments were severed. When Jesus' body reached the tomb, it was placed on a bed of perfumed spices. The headcloth was removed, and the shroud was folded over him, loosely wrapped with a thin strip of linen. This gentle yet hurried burial was necessitated by the impending Sabbath. His lifeless form, wrapped in pure linen, was left in the tomb, the entrance sealed with a rolled stone. Description: the shroud is a rectangular piece of cloth that measures approximately 4.4 by 1.1 meters, 14 feet 5 inches by 3 feet 7 inches, and is made of flax fibrils woven in a 3-to-1 herringbone twill pattern. The most distinctive feature of the cloth is the faint, brownish image of a man seen from the front and back. On the cloth, there is an image of a man with a beard, mustache, and shoulder-length hair parted in the middle. He appears muscular and tall, with various experts measuring him as between 1.70 to 1.88 meters, 5 feet 7 inches to 6 feet 2 inches. In 1532, a fire broke out in the chapel located in Chambéry, France, causing damage to the shroud. The linen suffered burn holes and scorched patches on both sides due to contact with molten silver, which burned through it in some areas while it was folded. To repair the damage, nuns sewed 14 large triangular patches and 8 smaller ones onto the cloth. Conservation. The shroud has undergone several restorations to preserve it and prevent further damage and contamination. It is stored in an airtight case made of laminated bulletproof glass. The case is temperature and humidity controlled to prevent chemical changes. The shroud itself is placed on an aluminum support that slides on runners and is stored flat within the case. According to the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Joseph of Arimathea wrapped Jesus' body in a linen cloth and laid it in a newly built tomb. However, the Gospel of John suggests that strips of linen were used for the same purpose. Joseph of Arimathea was a biblical figure who played an important role in the burial of Jesus Christ. His account can be found in each of the 4 Gospels: Matthew chapter 27, Matthew chapter 15, Luke chapter 23, and John chapter 19. Mark chapter 15 verses 42 through 46. When evening had already come, because it was the preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea came, a prominent and respected member of the council, Sanhedrin, Jewish high court, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, and he courageously dared to go in before Pilate and ask for the body of Jesus. Pilate wondered if he was dead by this time, only 6 hours after being crucified, and he summoned the centurion and asked him whether he was already dead. And when he learned from the centurion that Jesus was in fact dead, he gave the body to Joseph by granting him permission to remove it. So Joseph purchased a fine linen cloth for wrapping the body, and after taking Jesus down from the cross, he wrapped him in the linen cloth and placed him in a tomb which had been cut out of rock. Then he rolled a large wheel-shaped stone against the entrance of the tomb. Joseph of Arimathea was named after his hometown in Judea, to distinguish him from other Josephs mentioned in the Bible. Although there's not much biblical information about him, we can learn a few things from the text. Luke chapter 23 verse 50 states that Joseph was a member of the Jewish Council of Sanhedrin, which called for Jesus' crucifixion. However, verse 51 reveals that Joseph opposed the council's decision and was secretly a follower of Jesus. Mark chapter 15 verse 43 also confirms this. Joseph was a wealthy man. Matthew chapter 27 verse 57, although the source of his wealth is unknown. Additionally, The Bible portrays Joseph as a good and upright man. Luke chapter 23, verse 50. After Jesus was crucified, Joseph took a huge risk by approaching Roman Governor Pilate to request Jesus' body. Nicodemus, a Pharisee who had previously met with Jesus to inquire about God's kingdom, accompanied Joseph. Pilate granted them permission to take charge of Jesus' body, and they immediately began preparing it for burial. They followed the Jewish custom by wrapping the body in linen strips that were mixed with myrrh and aloe. However, it was the day of preparation, which was the 6th day of the week, just before the Jewish Sabbath, and they were running out of time. So, Joseph and Nicodemus quickly placed Jesus in Joseph's own tomb, which was located in a garden close to the place of crucifixion. Joseph and Nicodemus were unaware that they were fulfilling Isaiah's prophecy by placing Jesus in Joseph's tomb. The prophecy stated that he was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Isaiah chapter 53, verse 9. This is just one of many prophecies that serve to confirm Jesus' identity as the Messiah and Son of God. According to the Gospel of John, Simon Peter entered the tomb after Jesus' resurrection and found strips of linen, along with the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still in its place, separate from the linen. However, in the Gospel of Luke, it is mentioned that Peter ran to the tomb and saw the strips of linen lying by themselves while bending over. Jesus' suffering did not just start at the cross. The way to Jerusalem. These events took place roughly a week before Jesus was crucified. He knew he was headed to the spot where he would die, placing himself on Calvary's altar as a sacrifice for sin. The disciples were nervous, and they had a sense of foreboding in the air. Although Jesus had previously stated that he would die, they were unprepared for this message. They didn't want to hear Jesus talk like that. They had visions of an earthly kingdom. On the road to Jerusalem, we encounter Jesus alone with his thoughts, and the disciples are taken aback. Then, as the crowd grew larger, they became terrified. Jesus needed to say something encouraging. A sorrowful prediction. Mark chapter 10, verses 32 through 34. Now they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking on ahead of them. And they were perplexed at what Jesus had said, and those who were following were alarmed and afraid. And again he took the 12 disciples aside and began telling them what was going to happen to him, saying, "Listen very carefully. We are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed and handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and hand him over to the Gentiles, Romans. They will mock and ridicule him and spit on him, and whip, scourge him, and kill him. And 3 days later he will rise from the dead." Jesus said he would be betrayed, sentenced, and executed. Matthew chapter 8, verse 31. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must of necessity suffer many things and be rejected as the Messiah by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and must be put to death, and after 3 days rise from death to life. He had warned them that this would happen. The word that jumps out in that statement is would. Jesus spoke about the necessity of his cross. Mark chapter 9, verse 31. Because he was teaching his disciples and preparing them for the future, he told them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed and handed over to men who are his enemies, and they will kill him. And when he has been killed, he will rise from the dead 3 days later." Later. He mentioned his death again, but this time he used the term will. As he described what would happen to him, the emphasis was on the cruelty of the crucifixion. When Jesus made these prophecies, he was completely in control. Jesus handled his death in a way that we cannot. We understand that death is unavoidable, but we have no idea when, where, or how we will die. Jesus was fully aware of his death at Calvary. Instead of becoming a victim of circumstance or a martyr for a cause, Jesus was determined to pass. "No one takes my life, but I lay it down of myself," he told the followers. John chapter 10, verse 18. "No one takes it away from me, but I lay it down voluntarily. I am authorized and have power to lay it down and to give it up, and I am authorized and have power to take it back. This command I have received from my Father." Mark chapter 10, verses 33 through 34, saying, "Listen very carefully. We are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed and handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and hand him over to the Gentiles, Romans. They will mock and ridicule him and spit on him and whip, scourge him, and kill him. And 3 days later he will rise from the dead." Jesus also predicted that he would be betrayed to the chief priests and scribes, the religious authorities of the day, and would condemn him to death and deliver him to the Gentiles. They would insult, scourge, and spit on Jesus. He predicted. That's exactly what they did. At the end, Jesus foreshadowed his own resurrection. For some reason, this passed right over the disciples' minds. They never seemed to hear that Jesus would rise from the dead. The resurrection continues to astound everyone, including many Christians. Despite all of this, Jesus rose from the grave 3 days later. Jesus is as alive today as he was when he arose from the tomb. A shameful ambition. Every time Jesus mentioned the cross, another spiritual defect in these disciples' life was revealed. But that's what the cross does. It reveals the human heart, showing us how self-centered we are. Mark chapter 10, verses 35 through 36. James and John, the two sons of Zebedee, came to him saying, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he replied to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" James and John approached Jesus and begged him to grant their desire. They put their mother up to it, according to Matthew. So Jesus inquired as to what they desired him to perform for them. Matthew chapter 20, verses 20 through 21. Then Salome, the mother of Zebedee's children, James and John, came up to Jesus with her sons and, kneeling down in respect, asked a favor of him. And he said to her, "What do you wish?" She answered him, "Command that in your kingdom these two sons of mine may sit in positions of honor and authority, one on your right and one on your left." Mark chapter 10, verse 37. They said to him, "Grant that we may sit with you, one on your right and one on your left in your glory, your majesty and splendor in your kingdom." They stated that they desired specific places of honor in his glory. They were vying for the two most crucial posts in Jesus' kingdom's upper levels. Mark chapter 8, verse 38. "For whoever is ashamed here and now of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." All the transfiguration, Jesus had been speaking of his future glory and had shown them a glimpse of his kingdom. James and John heard a part of the message, which made them hesitant to accept the cross, but they were attracted to the idea of glory that it represented. Similarly, we tend to ignore the message of sacrifice and hardship, but when the word glory is mentioned, it catches our attention. Mark chapter 10, verse 38. But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism of suffering and death with which I am baptized?" They didn't understand what they were asking, so Jesus asked them, "Can you drink the cup that I drank and be baptized with the same baptism that I am baptized with?" Later, Jesus asked his disciples, "Shouldn't I drink the cup that my Father has given me?" He also said, "Father, if it's your will, please take this cup away from me, but I want your will to be done, not mine." John chapter 18, verse 11. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put the sword back in its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me?" That cup symbolized the agony Jesus would face at Calvary, and Jesus drank it all. When Jesus asked them about baptism, he was essentially asking if they were ready to fully immerse themselves in his mission. Mark chapter 10, verse 39. And they replied to him, "We are able," Jesus told them. "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and you will be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized." That's how we are. "Would you like to follow me?" Jesus inquires. "Yea, Lord, I can do it," we say. The problem concerning James and John is relevant to all of us. As Christians, we tend to focus more on the glory and rewards that come with our faith, rather than on serving and enduring the inevitable difficulties that come with it. However, the Bible teaches us that the path to glory always involves pain and sacrifice. Mark chapter 10, verses 40 through 41. but to sit on my right or left, this is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father." Hearing this, the other 10 became indignant with James and John. The other disciples were extremely dissatisfied when they heard about the discussion. That is because they desired these positions. Sacrificial redemption. Jesus was only a week away from being crucified, and his focus was on Jerusalem. However, his disciples were more concerned about who would sit in positions of power and glory. Jesus then gathered them and taught them about true greatness by contrasting his way with the ways of the world. First and foremost, Jesus willingly arrived to identify with us. Second, Jesus came to serve others, not to be served. He always helped those in need wherever he went. Third, Jesus' ultimate purpose was to offer his life as a ransom for many. The term ransom refers to paying a price in exchange for release. Jesus stated that he came to give his life as a ransom for many. This is a beautiful depiction of what Jesus did on the cross. He paid the price. The great stress that Jesus faced. Many people think that the road to the cross was easy for Jesus. If the decision were easy, the value of Jesus' sacrifice would be diminished. We read that Jesus was overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Imagine this. You are about to endure one of the most excruciating deaths a person can experience. You will face humiliation and insults, and the people coming to arrest you will arrive soon. The book of Luke recounts the story of Jesus' final journey to his death. From his prayer in Gethsemane, where his faith in God is reaffirmed, to his burial, the Bible describes how an innocent man died for the sake of others. The Gospels each include a narrative that describes the time that Jesus, his disciples, and others spent in the Garden of Gethsemane just before Jesus was arrested. Jesus prayed to his Father in the garden 3 times, saying, Matthew chapter 26, verse 39e, "And he went a little beyond them, and fell on his face and prayed, saying, My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." A little later, Jesus prays. Matthew chapter 26, verse 42. "He went away again a second time and prayed, saying, My Father, if this cup cannot pass away unless I drink from it, your will be done." These prayers reveal Jesus' complete surrender to God's will before his crucifixion. According to the Bible, when Jesus spoke about the cup, he was referring to the suffering he was going to endure in the future. It was as if he was being presented with a cup full of bitterness, and he was expected to drink it all. In Matthew chapter 20, verse 22, Jesus talked about suffering. Matthew chapter 20, verse 22. "But Jesus replied, You do not know what you are saying. Are you able to drink the cup that I am about to drink?" They said to him, "We are able." When Jesus prayed to the Father, "Let this cup pass from me," he was expressing the natural human desire to avoid pain and suffering. Although Jesus is fully God, he is also fully human. Despite being perfect, his human nature still struggled with accepting the torture and shame that awaited him, and his flesh recoiled from the cross. In the same context, Jesus told his disciples the following. Matthew chapter 26, verse 41. "Keep watching and praying, so that you do not come into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." When Jesus prayed, "Let this cup pass from me," he was fighting against the desires of his flesh, which yearned for self-preservation and comfort. The struggle was fierce, overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Then he said to them, "My soul is deeply grieved, so that I am almost dying of sorrow. Stay here and stay awake and keep watch with me." Matthew chapter 26, verse 38. This prayer, more than anything else, demonstrates that Jesus was in every way fully human. Jesus had foreknowledge of what was to come. Mark chapter 8, verse 31. "And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must of necessity suffer many things and be rejected as the Messiah by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and must be put to death, and after 3 days rise from death to life." The torment that he was going to go through was going to be more than just physical. It was also going to be mental and spiritual. Jesus was aware that it was God's plan for him to be crucified, that God wanted him to be pierced for our transgressions and wounded for our healing. Jesus knew that this was the will of God. Isaiah chapter 53, verses 5 through 7. But he was pierced for our offenses. He was crushed for our wrongdoings. The punishment of our well-being was laid upon him. And by his wounds we are healed. All of us like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way. But the Lord has caused the wrongdoing of us all to fall on him. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers, so he did not open his mouth. Jesus loves mankind, but his humanity dreaded the pain and sorrow he faced, and it drove him to ask his Father, "Let this cup pass from me." The phrase, "Let this cup pass from me," appears in Jesus' prayer, and it contains two significant qualifications. To begin, he utters the prayer, "If it is possible." Jesus implores his Father to let him choose an alternative path to redemption for humankind if one exists. Jesus did not want to die, but he followed the will of God. The events that occurred after he prayed demonstrate that there was no other way. The sacrifice of Jesus Christ is the only one that could possibly redeem the world. John chapter 1, verse 29. The next day he saw Jesus coming to him and said, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." Revelation chapter 5, verse 9. And they sang a new song, saying, "Worthy are you to take the scroll and to break its seals, for you were slaughtered, and you purchased people for God with your blood from every tribe, language, people, and nation." Second, Jesus prays, "Yet not as I will, but as you will." Jesus was committed to the will of God, body, mind, and soul. The prayer of the righteous is always dependent on the will of God. Matthew chapter 6, verse 10. "Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus conquered the flesh and kept it in subjection to the Spirit. He accomplished this by submitting himself wholeheartedly and fervently to the will of God. When we go through difficult times, it is comforting to know that Jesus understands what it's like to want God's will and yet not to want it, to desire righteousness and obedience, even when the flesh is screaming out against it. This conflict is not sinful. It is a normal part of being human. Our Redeemer fully embodied human nature in every aspect. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 17. Therefore, in all things he had to be made like his brothers, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. He successfully completed his mission by seeking and saving the lost, despite suffering until the end. His prayerful openness reveals a profound relationship with God. It was a difficult time, but the disciples failed to grasp the gravity of the situation and fell asleep. Luke chapter 22, verses 43 through 45. Now an angel from heaven appeared to him, strengthening him. And being in agony, he was praying very fervently, and his sweat became like drops of blood, falling down upon the ground. When he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping from sorrow. An angel appeared to comfort Jesus, which is significant as it shows that heaven stands by him as he faces his calling, even in difficult times. As he faced rejection and death, Jesus prayed to God and laid his burdens before him. This humanizes Jesus and shows that he experienced a range of emotions in the face of his death. Luke's portrayal of Jesus does not hide his divinity, but instead shows him as someone who can understand and empathize with our flaws and traumas. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things just as we are, yet without sin. This text reveals something about Jesus' character while demonstrating how we can face the great trials of life that God sends us. These verses show a man who is reliant on God and determined to do his will. We see a person who faces adversity by turning to God and another who expresses his intense emotions to God in prayer. Jesus is not spared the trial, but what is supplied is the strength to face it. Though he does not hesitate to ask if another way can be found, he affirms his determination to follow God's will. Heaven responds by giving Jesus the strength to face what God has called him to do, not by granting his request for another way. The passage revolves around this union of submission to the divine call and divine strength supplied. This passage highlights the admirable traits of Jesus as he confronts the trial of the cross. During prayer, Jesus openly expresses his anguish and dependence on God. His regular practice of communing with God remains unchanged, even amidst the unprecedented circumstances he faces. In contrast, we often tend to overlook seeking God's help when we are occupied with our daily activities. Trials often bring us to our knees, but the fast-paced life can prevent us from praying. However, this is not the case with Jesus. His example reminds us that prayer is essential, even in the midst of chaos. Jesus' prayer is not just a quick check-in. It is full of honesty, emotion, and pain. True prayer requires effort. Unfortunately, instead of putting in the effort, we often simply bow our heads, close our eyes, and let our minds wander. During prayer, Jesus demonstrates his honesty and humility. He sincerely expresses his hope that God will not force him to go through what is ahead of him, but he is even more committed to doing God's will. Though different from the laments and psalms, the prayer is similar in that it allows the petitioner to express their deepest emotions and pain to God. The private confrontation that occurs in prayer frequently produces the solace we require to take the next step while holding God's hand. Moreover, prayer is not a haphazard activity. As Jesus seeks God in the midst of his situation, he prays with his entire being, even sweating blood drops. Jesus can walk with God because he seeks him on a regular basis. It is interesting that Luke, a physician, would bring up this unusual medical condition. Hematidrosis is a rare condition. The current understanding is that when someone is stressed, the small blood vessels within sweat glands rupture, allowing blood to mix with sweat. According to Dr. Frederick Zugabe, this happens because around the sweat glands, there are multiple blood vessels in a net-like form. When a person is under great stress, the vessels constrict, and as the anxiety fades away, the blood vessels dilate to the point of rupture. The blood goes into the sweat glands, and as the sweat glands are producing a lot of sweat, it pushes the blood to the surface, coming out as droplets of blood mixed with sweat. This explanation sheds light on Jesus' situation in the garden. However, there is a challenging word in the Greek text that requires careful consideration. It says that his sweat became hosei, great drops of blood. Jesus in Gethsemane and his agony is the main point of the narrative. When Jesus arrives in the garden, he tells his disciples that he is deeply troubled and distressed. He is overcome with grief to the point of death. Luke captures this by referring to sweat as if it were drops of blood. Why is he overcome right now? The pain that Jesus endured was not simple, but rather complex. It becomes clear that he had to bear the penalty that sin deserved for millions upon millions of people. In the garden, Jesus' humanity is fully revealed and his agony is made known. In this moment, we see Jesus at his most vulnerable. Despite being sinless, he is experiencing the truest essence of what it means to be human. He is feeling our grief and facing stronger temptations than any of us ever have. It's fair to say that he was tempted in every possible way. As Christ gazes into the cup, he prays, "If it is possible, take this cup from me." He appeals again, but there is silence. He appeals a second time, but there is still silence. He appeals a third time, and again there is silence. Through his silence, we come to understand that this was God's will. Every leader feels alone at times, especially when venturing into new territory. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus experienced one of his most lonely moments. Every member of his team deserted him just hours before he was to be tried, tortured, and crucified. His story in the garden is one of history's most potent examples of a leader's dedication. Every leader who does something significant for God has a Gethsemane experience. What can we learn from this lonely time? Gethsemane is the location where, number 1, spiritual battles occur. Number 2, loneliness is felt. Number 3, honesty is expressed. Number 4, submission is required. Number 5, strength is received. We need to comprehend the solitude and the grief of Gethsemane because it helps us to understand the accomplishment of Gethsemane. Some have been a relation between bloody sweat on the brow of Jesus with the curse of Adam, who would toil by the sweat of his brow. Adam failed the garden test. Have you ever doubted God's love for you? Take a look at the Garden of Gethsemane. You can witness the Son of God sweating profusely, like drops of blood, showing his determination to not only obey the Father, but also to redeem humanity. He drank from the cup in your honor. And if you look at the Father's silence, you can see that there was no other way to redeem humanity, or else his wrath would be poured out on his Son. Let the logic of Romans chapter 8, verse 32 motivate you. He who did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? If God had not been committed to your redemption, he would have let humanity be swallowed up by his wrath while preserving his Son. But he did not. He did it not only because he loves us, but also because that is who God is. It is in his nature to be self-giving, to give of himself so that others may live. You can have faith in this. Who can be against you if God is on your side? If you attended Sunday school, you've probably heard this question dozens of times. Where did Jesus die? Ask some people, and they'll say, the place of the skull. Others say Calvary or Golgotha. All three titles refer to the location of Jesus' death on the cross on Good Friday. Over 2 millennia ago, this location has far more historical significance in the Bible and was not chosen randomly. Golgotha, also known as Calvary, is a skull-shaped hill in ancient Jerusalem where Jesus was crucified. It appears in all 4 Gospels. Golgotha is the Aramaic name of the location where Jesus was crucified outside of Old Jerusalem. In John chapter 19, verses 16 through 18, we read, "Then he handed him over to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus, and he went out, bearing his own cross, to the place called the place of the skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side, and Jesus between them." In Luke chapter 23, verse 33 of the King James Version, the word Calvary is used about the same location. In modern translations, the more literal term, the place that is called the skull, is generally used. Calvary comes from the Latin phrase for this location, Calvaria locus. John chapter 19, verses 15 through 17. So they shouted, away with him, crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king except Caesar." So he then handed him over to them to be crucified. They took Jesus, therefore, and he went out, carrying his own cross, to the place called the place of a skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. It was some well-known spot outside the gate. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 12. "Therefore Jesus also suffered outside the gate, that he might sanctify the people through his own blood." Luke chapter 23, verse 26. "And when they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, as he was coming in from the country, and placed on him the cross to carry behind Jesus." The location was also near the city and contained a garden. John chapter 19, verse 41. "Now there was a garden at the place where he was crucified, and in the garden a new tomb, cut out of solid rock, in which no one had yet been laid." Luke refers to the location of the crucifixion as the place called the skull. Luke chapter 23, verse 33, which can also be translated literally as the place called cranion, which is the generic Greek term for skull. Both Aramaic and Greek were common spoken languages in Israel during Luke's period, so he can recount what Matthew wrote in Aramaic. There is a good chance that this location had also gained some notoriety. If locals from nearby Jerusalem had given it a nickname, then it would have had fame, or in this case, it would have had infamy. In spite of the fact that we do not know the precise location, archaeologists have a pretty good idea of its general vicinity, which they refer to as outside the gates of Jerusalem. According to Grace Communion International, they've narrowed it down to 2 contenders. But in recent times, only 2 have been deemed worthy of serious concern. The traditional site lies within the area now occupied by the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the Christian quarter of the Old City. The other contending location is a rocky hill, commonly called Gordon's Calvary, just north of Jerusalem's Old City. We shouldn't be alarmed that we don't have an exact location for Jesus' death or even burial. Christianity focuses on the resurrection of Jesus rather than his death. After all, the angel declares, at Jesus' burial site, he is not here, he is risen. And when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull, they gave him wine mixed with bile to drink, and after tasting it, he was unwilling to drink it. Jesus had been very weak from the scourge. When the soldiers leave Pilate's palace to crucify Jesus outside the city walls, they realize that Jesus is so weak from being flogged that he will not be able to carry the cross. This realization leads to the soldiers' decision to crucify Jesus outside the city walls. Pilgrim Simon from Cyrene in North Africa is recruited by Roman soldiers to carry the crosspiece of Jesus to Golgotha, the place where Jesus was crucified. Simon's hometown is in North Africa. Matthew chapter 27, verses 35 through 36. When they had crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots. Sitting down, they kept watch over him there. Jesus is crucified, nailed to a cross, put through a humiliating and excruciating death. The crucifixion victims typically passed away after suffering for 2 or 3 agonizing days from thirst, exhaustion, and exposure to the elements. The soldiers divide up Jesus' clothes and then settle in to guard the execution. They make it a point to ensure that none of Jesus' many followers try to save him from being executed. Psalm 22 is undeniably fulfilled by the components of the scene. Psalm chapter 22, verse 1. My God, why have you forsaken me? Far from my help are the words of my groaning. Matthew chapter 27, verses 37 through 44. And above his head they put up the charge against him, which read, This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. At that time 2 rebels were being crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. And those passing by were speaking abusively to him, shaking their heads and saying, You who are going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross. In the same way, the chief priests also, along with the scribes and elders, were mocking him and saying, He saved others, he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him now come down from the cross, and we will believe in him. He has trusted in God. Let God rescue him now. If he takes pleasure in him, for he said, I am the Son of God. And the rebels who had been crucified with him were also insulting him in the same way. Psalm chapter 22, verse 7. All who see me laugh at me and mock me. They shoot out the lip, they shake the head, saying, At Golgotha, the highest levels of leadership also came to insult Jesus for the last time. Even the rebels who were being crucified alongside him made fun of him for his failed messianic claim. However, Golgotha, also known as Calvary, remains a powerful reminder of Jesus' ultimate sacrifice, which was the only sacrifice capable of forgiving sins and reconciling humankind with God. Acts chapter 4, verse 12. Salvation is found in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given to mankind by which we must be saved. There is a possibility that we do not know the precise location where Jesus was crucified, but we have 2 very good hypotheses. Thankfully, Jesus does not stay in Golgotha nor in the vicinity. Even though they bury him nearby on Easter Sunday, he conquers death and leaves the tomb. After the 40 days, he ascends into heaven. Even though Jesus died on the cross to pay for our sins, he does not end the story there. He offers us hope beyond the cross of Golgotha, that not only did he rise from the dead and win the victory over death, but also that we will one day experience a resurrection of our own. He was one of 3 people sentenced to death that day and hung between 2 thieves. One of these 2 men recognized Jesus and requested that the Lord remember him in the kingdom. Jesus responded, Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. Luke chapter 23, verse 43. Because of this, Jesus went to the cross to shed his blood to forgive and redeem the sinners who put their faith in him. This hill, which we call Golgotha, or Calvary, continues to stand as a reminder of Jesus' great sacrifice. Jesus' sacrifice was the only sacrifice that could forgive sin and reconcile man with God. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 12. But this man, after he had offered one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down on the right hand of God. A poem from Roy Allen Reed's It is Finished. It is finished was written to celebrate the victory Jesus Christ won on that first Good Friday, resounding throughout the universe, transcending time and space. It is the greatest shout of victory heard by the human race. From the lips of the Lord Jesus Christ came that tremendous cry. It is finished was his shout as he laid down his life to die. All Scripture has been fulfilled, and the prophecies now complete, as the one of whom all prophets speak held Satan in defeat. The battle has been won by him, the immortal God who died. His precious blood has flowed for sin, and the law is satisfied. How vast the ransom he has paid, for no work was left undone. The gate to heaven opened wide by God's one and only Son. Humankind has been redeemed, and the full price for sin is paid. The shame and suffering are over. Atonement has been made. My Lord and my love is crucified, the sinner's faithful friend. The Alpha and Omega is the beginning and the end. His perfect life sacrificed to pay the dreadful price of sins. The age of law ends at the cross as the age of grace begins. The great battle is over, and man's redemption has been won. No more need for types and shadows, for the will of God is done. Satan has been defeated by Jesus Christ the crucified. The sting of death is vanquished as the grave bursts open wide. And that wraps up our journey into the secrets of the Shroud of Turin. It's like a puzzle with science, history, and faith all mixed together. The special patterns on the cloth, the image of the guy on it, and the wounds that came before the picture, they make us wonder. The shroud tells stories from long ago, like a traveler leaving hints in the dirt from Jerusalem to faraway places. The blood on it stays a bright red. The body's shape is just right, making it all more interesting. Even the tiny flowers on it tells tales of where it might have been. So, as we say goodbye to the Shroud of Turin, let's keep these questions in our heads. It's like an exciting mystery that makes us want to explore more, whether it's a real thing or a reflection. The Shroud is like a cool painting where science, history, and faith meet. Thanks for joining us on this adventure through time and mystery.